everybody. I'm back again, um, and super late because I can't be consistent, but that's fine because it was for a good reason. For those of you just tuning in, I am currently reading my dad's manuscripts. Today I am continuing reading the Saga of Haram, and yeah, I'm going to pop right on into it because this was a beefy one. Yep, this is a beefy one. So it's going to take a little bit to read. And I don't have a beverage with me, so pardon me while I get parched. Alrighty. Yeah. Also, this is chapter 12 of 32. So I'm getting closer to the halfway mark. So if you're just tuning in and this is your first time watching, I recommend going back to the beginning so you can get an understanding of what's happening in the story because it's all very episodical. Episodic. There we go. So it has a bunch of things happening, and we are where we are at now. um, when last we left our hero, there was a strange man reaching down and wanting his sword, saying, "Hey, that's our sword, our booty, because we've defeated the goblins, and I don't care if it's your sword or not." And Harem said no, and that's where we left off. So, without further ado, let's tear on in and find out what happens next. Just a quick warning, I will be live editing, so that does mean that every once in a while I'll be bending down and marking things up. So if you hear a bit of a pause in my reading, that's what's going on. So, and now, chapter 12 of the Saga of Haram. A hollow feeling crept into the pit of Haram's stomach. He had recovered his sword. He had ceased to be the thing the goblins tormented at all. Now he was being told to give up the sword again. "No," he said. The words came hard to his tongue after so long with the goblins. But silence had always been safest. For a moment, he thought to explain more, then decided that it made no difference. The man frowned. He was slightly smaller than Haram and a little broader across his shoulders, with dark hair and a lumpy, pardon me, and a lumpy nose that looked as though it had been broken at least once. He put a hand on his own sword. Haram brought up his own blade to a level with the other's stomach. "No," he said again, then forcing the words to come, he said, "It is my sword, and I have taken it back from the goblins, and I will not give it up again." The man looked at him, looked down at the blade, back at Haram's face, then turned on his heel and walked away. Haram went back to Vraka's body and unbelted the sheath. As he was putting it on, another man, a taller, slender one, came up shouting at him. Haram drew the sword and held it ready. "Let me be, fellow. You can have all the plunder. All I wished are the sword and the sheath." He felt a strange beleaguered sensation. Not at all the way he might expected to feel on the day of his liberation from the goblins. The man looked at him and backed away. Haram stood quietly. The little broad man was coming toward him again, in the company of one who was clearly the leader of the band. This man wore chain armor, well made and well kept, and a blue surcoat over it. He had a long sword sheathed at his back so he could draw it across his shoulder and strike in the same motion. He kept his hands clear of the sword, though. His face was clean-shaven, tanned, and he had a pair of piercing blue eyes. "My name is Vorath, and I'm captain of this band. Kano tells me you claim that sword." "Yes." "Only yes? No explanations?" Vorath was smiling, and seemed friendly enough. Haram strove for an answering smile, but was not certain to what degree he was successful. "I have already explained." The words still came with difficulty. "Did Kano not tell you?" Ah, but will you not tell me yourself? Please? The sword was taken from me when I was made prisoner by the goblins. I have recovered it today. You have recovered it through the work of my lads and myself. Does that not give us some claim on it as legitimate spoil? Haram shrugged. It happened to be today, but I would have taken it one time or another. And you recognize no claim of ours? No, it is my sword and I will not part with it again. Borth was still smiling, though a little forced. We could take it from you. You are no fool. You could only take it from me by killing me. And I assure you, it is a mere sword, of great value only to me, and not worth fighting for. The words came easier now, though only a little. What of clothing? What of it? Hiram looked down at himself, clad only in the ragged remnants of a pair of trousers. Do you think to offer me to trade me for clothing for the sword? Captain laughed. No, not hardly. I will give you some clothing freely, and we will not fight you over the sword. As you say, we are not fools. Come, let us have a bite to eat, and you can tell us your story. They prepared their food and ale. Wait, they prepared their food and ate. The captain gave Haram some clothing to put on, and they all listened as Haram described the early morning attack, which ended with him being a prisoner of the goblins. And you, he asked, how was it that you happened to be at the very top of the hill the goblins climbed? By Tran and Buren, that was mere chance. You see, our scout had warned us that the goblins were marching our way. We had no real desire to fight so many, so we moved aside up to the top of the hill, keeping crest between ourselves and the goblins. When they began to climb the hill, we were certain we had been seen, so we made ready to fight. We aimed first our arrows at the leaders and then rode to the attack. And why do you smile so? The goblins climbed the hill not because they are aware of your presence, but because their officers are punishing them for slacking. Wareth laughed out loud. Fortunate turn of events for you, then. Yes, indeed. May I travel with you at least as far as the next town? Wareth hesitated for a moment, then smiled. Of course. He had not been able to keep count of the days of the goblins, but he now discovered he had been with them a little over a year. Having spent so much time with the goblins in watchful silence, he found it difficult to regain the habit of casual conversation. The initial argument over the sword had placed a further barrier between himself and Voreth's band, so he was left fairly much alone. Tano had still not forgiven him for the sword, and muttered under his breath whenever he was near Haram. One day, as he walked by, he muttered, any real man would die rather than be slave to goblins. Haram looked up. You said something? I said any real man would rather die than be a slave to goblins. Ah, I thought as much. For a moment, Tano was dumbstruck. He'd been expecting a fight, or at least an argument, but not this. When he spoke again, it was to begin cursing Haram in very imaginative terms as several sorts of coward. Haram got to his feet. Are you quite done? Tano stood there sputtering. The next time you speak to me, leave your sword in your hand, Tano. Do you understand me? Tano stared at him a moment, then spun on his heel. Tano! Haram made his voice snap out. The man turned back. Haram had his sword in hand already. I asked you a question, Tano. Do you understand me? Haram was quite sure that Tano would draw his own sword, and was also quite sure that Tano was the better swordsman. But on the other hand, he found that he did not care very much, that life or death were all one to him. Tano looked in his face and paled. Yes, he said with a gulp. I understand. Good, said Haram, and felt a little disappointed that the matter had ended so easily. Somewhat later, Worth approached him. Go a bit easy on the lads, will you? They are not sure what to make of you. Should I go easy on them? Let them leave me be, and I will leave them be. Wait, should I go easy on them? Let them leave me be, and I'll leave them be. I know. But when you look at Tana with a look that says that it matters not whether you live or die, you practically dare him to draw his sword, it upsets the lads. What will you do now? I hadn't thought of that. Sorry, bear with me here. Let's try that again. I know. But when you look at Tana with the look in the eye, with the look that says that it matters not to you whether you live or die, and practically dare him to draw the sword, it upsets the lads. What will you do now? I hadn't thought of that, answered Haram, and found it was perfectly true. He had not thought of anything in the future. He had no money at all, and with little prospect of earning any immediately. Could I not travel with you? Forth shook his head. Not that I doubt your courage or skill, but the band has no more need of members yet. We've had a long spell of little plunder, and what we took from the goblins was not great. So to take on another member under these circumstances, his voice trailed off, and he looked at Haram embarrassedly. Haram dealt with the band mostly through Vorath. The day after they had discussed Haram's joining the band, Haram asked, Vorath, could you get me a piece of leather about the size of the palm of my hand, and a couple pieces of cord about the length of my arm? I think I might. What do you need them for? I want to make myself a sling. He remembered Orit's comments on the sling as a simple but effective weapon. He picked up a few pebbles from the ground and he began practicing as they walked. He found that just as his arms and hands had remembered the use of the sword, they also remembered the use of the sling. In fact, he was able to knock down a quail or two from time to time for supper. The men of Boris' band were still hesitant about accepting him, though they appreciated his contributions to their larder. All save one of the men of the red or black-haired stock of Eridor. Eridar. What? Okay, hold on. Yeah, there's going to be some marking up here. I can tell this right now. Hold on. Oh boy. Okay. Okay. All save one were men of the red or black-haired stock of Eridar. Vorath, Tano, Hurl, Coron, Dreven. The last one, Afakion, Afalkayon, was shorter and swarthy with jet black hair. Haram understood that he was from the island of Rahassan to the east. Okay, that was just a complete awkward sentence right there. Pardon. Haram did not ask where they were going, and it was only when they arrived at the town of Sanda that he realized he was in the habit of asking no questions. He walked along quietly beside Boris' horse, patiently going wherever the band was going. When they came to the inn, an establishment which went by the name of the Bull's Head, Vorath leaned down to speak to Haram. You will be our guest until we leave the inn. No, no, I insist. We're not so penurious as all that. Haram quietly acquiesced. While they were seated at the supper table, a man came in. He was well dressed for a villager, and a little stout. He carried in his hand a heavy staff. He approached the table. Good evening, sirs. I'm Croso, mayor of this town. Good evening, mayor. Troso? Troso? Croso. Croso. Probably Croso. Good evening, mayor. What can we do for you? Ah, exactly. Sir, there is a band of goblins in the neighborhood who have been raiding the local farms. Lately, they've been taking to raiding the houses on the edge of town, and we wish to have them dealt with. What of the local baron? Has he no troops to deal with such matters? The mayor shrugged. 3 times in the last 2 years, messages have been sent to no effect. The baron assures us that he has our difficulties in mind, and that he will deal with them as soon as they may be. But we cannot wait any longer. So then, Boris took a sip of his wine. How many goblins are there? The mayor shrugged again. About 20 and 30, we think. Arms? The usual. Swords and maces and spears, a number of bows and arrows. Vorath frowned. And what will you pay us for this, if we were to fight the goblins on your behalf? Pay you, sirs? One would think the plunder to be had from the goblin lair would be pay enough. It might be, and it might not be. Suppose we find the goblins, but we never find their lair. What then? Then what? We might find ourselves putting our lives at risk for a handful of silver ponies? No, we must do better than that. So they discussed the matter. Offer and counter-offer, and Haram, very much reminded of Asteran, felt a twinge of something like homesickness. The bargaining ended. Agreed then, declared Vorath. A bounty of 5 silver ponies for every goblin head, and with a bonus of 80 if the total number of heads exceeds 20. Agreed. The two clasped hands to seal the bargain. After supper, Vorath took his band apart. After supper, Vorath took his band apart and talked to them. Haran was almost certain that this discussion involved him, but since he had not been invited, he paid no attention. And after a while, Vorath left the band and approached Haran. You heard how many goblins they believed to be present. We would not wish to encounter 20 or more in an open fight. My plan is to whittle away their numbers in ambushes and the like until we have a better chance against them in an open fight. There's a risk in even such a plan. We may meet up with numbers of them in a place where we cannot run away. If that were to happen, an extra sword would be a good thing to have. Would you join us for the time being? And what would my share be? Vorath looked a little shamefaced. I talked to the lads, and I talked to them. But the end was the same. A flat silver pieces, however much we make. They are not willing to see you given a share, even a beginner's share. They say that whatever you may have done with Ort's band, you have not proven yourself with us, and do not have merit a regular share. Haram remembered the days with Ortst, and remembered the 5 silver pieces was never something to be sneezed at. And at present he only had his sword and sheath and a suit of clothing borrowed from Vorath. I accept, he said. Ah, good, I will tell the others. But Vorath was looking at him curiously. Haram realized that his acceptance sounded like little less than overwhelming. Yeah, give me a second here. Harum realized that his acceptance sounded little less than overwhelming. Perhaps Vorath was even regretting his offer a little now. Then the leader turned to go back and inform the band. Harum stood on the outskirts of the skirmish, whirling his swing around his head. That that little tracker was dodging back and forth, avoiding closed combat. He stopped for a moment, and Harum released his stone. He saw it rebound upward from the goblin's head, and the tracker threw up his arms and fell. Harum put another stone in his sling, but by now the last of the goblins were dead. There had been 7 of them on the path, and when Vorath and his band had come roaring out of the bush at them, now the band were tumbling the slain and searching for anything that might be of value. That evening, around the campfire, Vorath addressed the whole band. We've used the same trick twice, hiding along the paths where the goblin traces were clear to be seen, and ambushing them when they come. Goblins are not highly intelligent, but though we might count on using the same tactic again. But though we might count on using the same tactic again, I prefer to do something different. Oh boy. Had you some other plan in mind? Asked Tano, rubbing at an old scar on his forearm. Horace rewarded Tano with a smile. Ah, just a question. I had something in mind, but it requires a bit of risk from someone. So here is my thought. So it was that Harum found himself walking along one of the goblin trails late in the evening of the 3rd day after the last ambush. He moved carefully, stopping occasionally to listen for sounds of movement ahead of him. As he slipped quietly along the trail, he wondered how he had allowed himself to convinced to take on this task. Even as he wondered, he knew the answer. An extra 5 silver ponies, he muttered. What a wonderful inducement for a man whose only clothing belongs to someone else. He paused again, then moved off the trail into the shadows. It was entirely possible that the goblins had already heard him coming and were waiting in ambush for him. Though he had lived with them for a long time, he had no illusions about his ability to outstalk a goblin. He waited, all his senses alert. There was a sudden movement up the trail. A small goblin, half hidden in brush, was peering down the trail. Harum smiled. And I know what you're thinking, goblin. Are they waiting for an ambush for me up ahead? Come along and find out. In the same moment, he realized he was in a tricky position. He was not properly in hiding, and the goblin had only missed him so far because Harum was standing perfectly still. Even if he continued to stand perfectly still, it was not at all certain that the goblin would continue to overlook him. But there's little else he could do now. Breathing slowly and quietly, he watched and waited. The plan called for him to find a hiding place well up the trail and ambush the goblin scouts. This would enable them to take the main body unawares as they came along the trail. He had warned them of the danger of this maneuver. If he met a large party of goblins, the plan might fall apart right there and then, with him in the point of great danger. Ah, don't fret yourself, Vorath insisted. We'll be close behind you all the time. Only give the signal, and we will be there in moments. The goblin was moving again, coming along the trail quite quickly and silently, moving like an illusion made of smoke. This was another of the tracker goblins, whose skill Asteran had spoken of. His eyes flickered from one side of the path to the other, passing over Haram in his hiding place, so that was a sign of recognition. Closer he came, closer and closer. In 3 steps, he'd be close enough that Haram would be able to draw his sword and strike. Then the goblin's eyes passed over Haram's hiding place again, and suddenly flickered back. He was seen. The goblin spun in his tracks and began to run back down the trail. Haram followed. The instant it had taken for the goblin to turn had been enough for him to leap out in pursuit. His longer legs gave him the extra speed to be able to catch up. He drew his sword as he ran, and a moment later he struck the goblin down. As he fell, the goblin gave a loud squawk. Haram wondered how far back the main body of goblins might be. If they heard that noise, there might still be trouble. He wiped off his sword and sheathed it, then began to drag the goblin off the trail. The tracks left by the goblin's heels would be visible even to the least wary of goblins, but with any luck, they would not notice until it was too late. As he was settling the goblin into the shadows beside the trail, he heard the sound of tramping and trampling. A moment later, the trail was full of goblins. He was not sure how many there were, but he was sure that it was too late to run. He took the whistle Vorath had given him and blew 3 long blasts on it. A moment later, the goblins were surging toward him. He raised his sword and charged. He was dimly aware of them shouting at them in goblin language. May the demons feed on your ancestors. A particularly insulting phrase. He was also aware of striking with his sword at a large goblin who bore a resemblance to Vraka. Then he only saw a red haze in front of his eyes. That would be Barbarian Rage. So, yeah, it's a little bit of a longer one, and it's a little bit later. I'm very sorry. I do hope that you were able to look at the past broadcast in order to watch this. So, thank you very much for tuning in whenever you do. And I will talk to you again tomorrow night, whenever that happens. Pardon me. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will find out what happens tomorrow. Have a good night.